You're listening to Talking to Teens, where we speak with leading experts from a variety of disciplines about the art and science of parenting teenagers. I'm your host, Andy Earle. We're here today with Judith Warner talking about middle school. Judith is the New York Times best-selling author of books like Perfect Madness, Motherhood in the Age of Anxiety, We've Got Issues, Children and Parents in the Age of Medication, and the book And Then They Stopped Talking to Me, Making Sense of Middle School. Judith is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and she is speaking with us today about middle school, her experience as a middle school parent, and what Judith learned about middle school while writing this book. We're going to talk about why middle school is so emotional for parents and for teenagers, a journalism technique that parents can use when they're interviewing their teenagers to get more information about anything you want, how to find the balance between being interested but not too interested in whatever your teenager is saying. And we're going to see how fear is really at the root of all the biggest mistakes that parents make during the middle school years. Judith, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This book is what I read of yours, and then they stopped talking to me, making sense of middle school. So much stuff that I thought was really, really interesting, a different way of thinking about middle school. And then you write about it in a really beautiful and thought-provoking way, I think, and you bring in so many stories and different people's experiences. So I think it's really cool, and I'm just curious what got you interested in this topic, or motivated enough to do all of this work to collect all these stories and create this book.
It was really the experience of being a middle school parent, not having middle schoolers so much as being in the world of middle school parents and noticing a lot of kind of strange things going on in the parent behavior, which it seemed to me really changed noticeably when our kids got to be in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And, this was a group of parents who had been together for a long time, so there was a frame of reference. And I just found that there were all these kind of weird middle schoolerish things happening among the parents. And I found that on the inside, I was kind of hyper reactive to things that were happening, even if I wasn't engaging in them, just in, how they felt on the inside. And I thought there had to be something overdetermined about the degree to which things were bothering me, or things that happened to my daughters were bothering me. And I figured the same was true for the other adults as well. And I was really, really eager to find out who the 12-year-olds were who were walking around inside of us. And that was the original point of departure.
As you point out in the book, there's so much of parenting that feels like you're re-experiencing life through your kids, and middle school is not necessarily the most fun thing to re-experience or to kind of go through like that.
There's so much about parenting that throws you into middle schooler-ish situations, in that, you're in social situations where you're with a bunch of other people who you wouldn't necessarily choose as your friends, but you're kind of stuck with them for the long haul, because your kids are in class with them, and some of them you would choose as your friends, some of them you do, and they become wonderful friends. Some you have to learn to tolerate, just as kids have to. And there's a lot. I mean, there are a lot of stories in the book, way more out there than anything I experienced, of parents treating one another in these kind of middle schoolerish ways. And in talking about the book, I talk to more people and I hear more of these stories. So it really seems to be something that a lot of people see and experience. And of course, it just reflects the fact that parents of kids that age tend to be having a really hard time. It's a very hard time to be a parent.
You write that middle school is a sense of not belonging, not fitting in, and feeling like the wrong sort of person, which I thought was just such a good description of this time of life.
That description came very much from my interviews. I mean, people have written about the way it feels to be a kid that age for centuries, really. I mean, they're talking about the age of puberty, which was older in the past, than middle school age. But, really going back for centuries, you find writing about this that adults have been fascinated with this age and kind of, and, sometimes even in some ways obsessed with it. But the interviews that I did at the very beginning were with adults looking back on themselves. Then I got to interviewing parents and educators, and experts. And this is what emerged from those stories, which were just so powerful. I realized in doing them that if you ask somebody the question, tell me what middle school was like for you, or tell me your middle school experience, you sort of get their entire life encapsulated in a 2-hour telling. Partly because what happens then is very important, but partly also because of the importance that we bring to it. And the fact that what happens to us at that point hits us at a time developmentally where everything sinks in more deeply and the memories are sharper, um, and things just kind of cling to us in a way that they might not at other ages.
You do something interesting in this book, which is you kind of look through the history of adolescence through time, and you point out sort of that, like, well, if you go back in time, people were sent out on apprenticeships or sent out of the house around 11 and 12 years old. We didn't even have this period. So how did we get here then? Then what created this phenomenon that we now have of parents and teenagers being at war with each other and under the same roof?
Yeah, and also this place in the mind called middle school in the US. So partly, as you say, it is in human history, at least, it's a relatively recent phenomenon that most parents and most kids are continuing to live under the same roof, certainly after the age of puberty, but even, as young as in this country, 11 or 12, because until the mid to late 19th century, most kids were starting to live at least up to a certain point separately from their parents at that point. If they were wealthy, they were sent off to boarding school, if they were boys. If they were basically everyone else, they were being sent out to work in the fields, to work as a servant in other people's homes, let's say, or sent out to apprentice. And it was really only with the Industrial Revolution when it became more important to get an education. There became to be more opportunities for people in, the growing middle class, office work, things that came from, becoming more educated, that there became an emphasis on keeping kids in school longer and year round. And then the schools became overcrowded and the junior high schools came into being at the beginning of the 20th century. And some of that was because of education reformers saying this, is a specific and important age. At that point, it was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And they, these kids need an education that's different from that of 6-year-olds, because in the past, many places they were all in one schoolhouse. And also because of overcrowding, that they needed new buildings. And through those two experiences of extended time living together and then having kids in school together, in a sense, modern middle schooler was born, and parents started complaining about them in very much the same ways that they do now.
And I think that's so key because, as you point out, a lot of these phenomenon are related to that group effect. And the fact that we take all the 12 to 15-year-olds and put them in the same environment together as a big group.
It's tough for them. And it also has, ever since the junior high schools came into being in 1909, it's been really hard for parents because it's the first time that their kids are kind of moving outside of their orbit, making friends who they don't know from the neighborhood, going into homes of people, who they don't know, and just being in a much larger environment with kids from all over where they feel like they can't anymore control the cultural stuff that they're up against, the what used to be called the moral education of their children, that we don't think of that way anymore, but that kind of is the same thing. And also technology started changing in the 20th century, even if it at the beginning was what used to be called motion pictures or radio. Each time there's some technological change, kids this age eat it up, and parents are really worried about it being a bad influence, like a corrupting influence.
I found this really interesting. You talk about conflict. The idea that conflict is sort of central to adolescent development comes from Freudian thinking and from, I guess, Anna Freud in the 30s. And it never actually was really backed up by research, but was just sort of assumed to be true, I guess. It kind of got into the popular thinking.
Well, there's always been a big gap between the way, or there has long been, I wouldn't say always been, there has long been a big gap between the way experts talk about kids that age and the way parents perceive them. I would say at the early point in the, history of psychologists specifically looking at kids this age, there wasn't
Yeah,
that gap. So, this is an age group that adults have found displeasing for a really, really long time. They're difficult. They point out all your hypocrisies, they're moody. And they're just generally, it's right after the period of their having been so sweet and cuddly and loving. So it hits
right.
parents full force, when the early adolescent behavior kicks in. And the complaints about them, go back to the late 19th century, the most difficult time in a parent's life. They're, always criticizing, always fighting and bickering, especially girls with their mothers. And then what was really interesting, when Anna Freud wrote about them, and Anna Freud was in the 1930s the person who emerged as kind of the voice of, psychological thinking about adolescence. Basically, her perceptions were formed by how difficult psychoanalysts found them. So it was just, speaking from the same perspective of personal difficulty again, the way parents were, rather than really doing
Right.
any kind of objective research, which, psychoanalysts didn't do back then, any kind of hardcore experimental research. So she just, generalized from the experience in the office to a general rule about uh, adolescence. And the thing is, much of what she said is true, and it certainly makes for really great quotes. But the problem is, it isn't true of all adolescents, and certainly not of all middle schoolers.
So one thing that you point out that you say had changed about middle school today compared to when you were going through middle school is the amount of freedom and having, I guess, like the boundary.
The boundary between the adult world and the kid world. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think a lot of Gen Xers remember this and talk about it. It's certainly the older Gen Xers, of which I'm one, that we remember when we were growing up that our parents were just a lot less involved in, invested in our day-to-day lives, and certainly
Right.
not our friendships, in the kind of really down in the weeds kind of micromanaging way that parents very often are today. And it's sort of ironic, at least in my own case, because I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, that much of what parents do today is driven by a concern with their kids' safety. But in fact, the world generally, I mean, statistics back this up, it's not just New York City, is much safer for kids now than it was, even going back to the 90s. We live in a safer, cleaner, in many ways better time. And, there's been, and I've written about this in other places too, it's just this generation of parents has long had the issue of being enmeshed with their children, of not being able to see or not wanting to have emotional boundaries with their children, where they're the adults and the children are the children. And that too stems from a good place, I think. I mean, I think for a lot of, for my cohort, sort of younger baby boomer parents and older Gen Xers, we had parents who were kind of a little bit following the Mad Men model of benign neglect. And a lot of people didn't feel seen. Now, I don't know if that's really so generationally specific or age specific for Gen Xers, that may extend down in age a bit more too. I think it's different for millennials. I really do. But there was this feeling of a need to make sure that their kids, our kids, never felt unseen, unheard, emotionally invalidated the way so many of us did. And so, as my daughter always teases me, like every emotion must be expressed and validated. And this comes through in parenting in a whole lot of different ways. And the unfortunate way that it comes through in middle school parenting is that when the clickiness starts and the friendships drama starts, all of which is just normal and hardwired and kind of par for the course. I'm not talking about really out there bullying.
Right.
They're so enmeshed in it and they want to fix it. They feel like they need to protect their kids from feeling anything of the pain that they felt at the same age. And it always makes things worse. Always, always, always.
We're here with Judith Warner talking about how to make sense of the middle school years. And we're not done yet. Here's a look at what's coming up in the second half of the show.
And most people are feeling really isolated because, unlike early childhood, middle school is an age when parents don't sort of swap stories or, tell heroic tales of staying up all night or whatever. It becomes really important to put a good face on things and make sure that your child is saving face. A lot of the same stuff kids are doing in a way. While parents worry a lot about social media and they worry a lot about the influence of their kids' friends, et cetera, when it comes to long-term happiness, those are not the real dangers. The dangers are the values all around us. It's biological. I mean, the period around puberty is the biggest time of brain change after the 0 to 3 period. It's what scientists call a critical period, a second critical period, where new connections are made, old connections are shut down by pruning. The brain becomes more efficient, develops all sorts of new capabilities, but also as a result of all of this development and change is a lot more vulnerable to environmental insult. And that could be, having unhappy social experiences at school or substances, all sorts of things have a disproportionate impact on the brain in this period. And certainly, I unfortunately, and you may disagree with me, and I'm sure many listeners will, but we've all been kind of sold a bill of goods about weed, which has been presented to this generation as a substance that is benign, certainly more benign than alcohol. The mental health community has been arguing against that since before weed legalization. And they are now seeing the fallout of it, especially with teenagers and young adults. And, the one psychiatrist I spoke with who specializes in kids this age, I'm not talking about middle schoolers now, but well, probably does, but adolescents and young adults, said, we have just conducted a huge uncontrolled experiment on an entire generation. And we're only now beginning to see the results. So, I say this not to be, I don't know, to be sort of this moralistic, scary person, but, and I, from reading the book that I really try to kind of calm parental fears down. But when it does come to this one area, I just think that there's been such a failure in terms of public education, and public health warnings and everything else that's gone around tobacco or alcohol or seatbelts, you name it. And parents ought to be aware of it because it's doing such a disservice to their kids.
Want to hear the full interview? Sign up for a subscription today. You get access to all the interviews I've conducted, as well as new episodes weeks before the general public. It's completely affordable, and your subscription helps support the work we do here at Talking to Teens. Thanks for listening.